The sun was setting over Willow Creek, a quiet little town tucked away in Oregon's dense forests. The air was crisp, and the streets were nearly empty as I drove toward my destination. Evermoran stood on the outskirts of town, an imposing structure that seemed to hold secrets in its ancient walls. I'd driven past it a dozen times before, but never really paid attention. Tonight, it was different. I was desperate for work, and the ad on the community board had been my only lead. Night receptionist needed at Evermore Inn, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Generous pay. Call 503-555-0199 to apply. The pay was too good to ignore, and the hours weren't terrible. I figured it was just another job. Sit at the front desk, check people in, and keep an eye on things. Simple enough. I called the number and spoke to a man named Mr. Carlisle. His voice was calm and professional, but something about his tone made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He invited me for an interview that very night, which seemed odd, but I didn't question it. I needed this job. When I arrived, the sight of Evermoran made me pause. The building was massive, a Gothic-style hotel with tall arched windows and ivy climbing up its weathered stone walls. It was the kind of place you'd expect to see in an old horror movie, with its dimly lit exterior and an air of forgotten grandeur. I parked my beat-up car under a flickering street lamp and approached the heavy wooden doors, my breath visible in the chilly night air. Inside, the lobby was even more unsettling. The chandelier hanging above looked like it hadn't been dusted in years, and the worn carpet muffled my footsteps as I approached the front desk. Behind it stood a man in a perfectly tailored black suit. His appearance was immaculate, too perfect, almost like he'd stepped out of a vintage portrait. "You must be Alex," he said, his voice smooth and composed. "Yes, sir. Thank you for meeting with me," I replied, trying to mask my nervousness. He gestured toward a leather chair by the fireplace. "Let's talk." The interview was brief. He didn't ask about my experience or why I wanted the job. Instead, he seemed focused on my ability to follow rules and stay calm under pressure. "We've had difficulty keeping night staff," he explained, his eyes fixed on me in a way that felt both calculating and expectant. "This job isn't for everyone, but if you can follow instructions, you'll do just fine." He handed me a keyring and a laminated sheet of paper. "These are the rules. Memorize them. Follow them exactly. And one more thing," he added, his voice dropping slightly, "do not, under any circumstances, open room 13. No matter what you hear, no matter what happens." The words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to laugh it off, but his expression was dead serious. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and tucked the paper into my pocket. By 10 p.m., Mr. Carlisle was gone, leaving me alone in the cavernous hotel. The lobby was eerily quiet, with only the ticking of an antique clock and the faint hum of the radiator filling the space. I unfolded the laminated sheet and scanned the rules. Rules for the night shift at Evermore Inn. Always keep the lobby well lit. Shadows attract attention. Check the guest log at the beginning of your shift and after every hour. Do not leave the front desk between 12 a.m. and 12:30 a.m. If you hear knocking at room 13, ignore it. Do not use the elevator between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. The rest of the list seemed mundane, but those particular rules stuck out to me. What was it about room 13? And why couldn't I use the elevator during those hours? I shook my head, trying to focus. A job's a job, I told myself. No point in overthinking it. I spent the first hour familiarizing myself with the lobby and the surrounding areas. The guest log showed that every room except room 13 was occupied. The names were unremarkable, just a list of seemingly ordinary guests. But something about the log felt off. The handwriting in the check-in column was the same for every name, as if one person had written them all. Around midnight, I heard a faint creaking sound from down the hall. At first, I thought it was just the old pipes, but as the sound grew louder, it became clear. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing from the corridor leading to room 13. I froze, my pulse quickening. Grabbing a flashlight, I reluctantly left the front desk and walked toward the hallway. The air felt heavier the closer I got, like the atmosphere itself was warning me to turn back. Room 13 was at the very end of the hall. Its door was identical to the others, but it exuded a presence that was hard to explain. I stood there, staring at the brass numbers on the door, when suddenly, I heard it, a soft knock from inside the room. My heart raced. The rule was clear, ignore it, but curiosity gnawed at me. Who, or what was inside? I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the door. As I turned to head back to the lobby, I felt a chill run down my spine, as if someone, or something, was watching me. When I returned to the desk, I checked the camera feed for the hallway. My blood ran cold. The door to room 13 was now slightly ajar, and the faint outline of a shadowy figure could be seen just beyond the threshold. I sat frozen in my chair, gripping the desk for support. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. When Mr. Carlyle returned at 6 a.m., he looked me over and smiled. "You survived," he said simply. I wanted to demand answers, to ask about the shadow in the hallway, but his calm demeanor made it clear I wouldn't get any. "Just follow the rules, Alex," he said, patting me on the shoulder. "You'll get used to it." I wasn't sure if I wanted to come back for a second shift, but as I stepped outside into the morning light, one thought lingered. What happens if I break the rules? After my first night at Evermore Inn, I didn't want to go back. The unsettling silence, the cryptic rules, and the presence near room 13 were enough to make anyone question their sanity. But the money was good, and the small town of Willow Creek didn't exactly have a booming job market. Against my better judgment, I found myself clocking in for my second shift the following evening. Mr. Carlyle greeted me at the front desk, just as polished and poised as the night before. "Good evening, Alex," he said, his smile just a little too perfect. "Any questions before we start?" I wanted to blurt out a dozen questions, about the shadow in room 13, about the names in the log, about why this place felt so wrong, but I hesitated. Something about the way he looked at me made it clear that he wasn't going to answer. Instead, I forced a polite smile and shook my head. "Good," he said, handing me the updated guest log. "Remember the rules. Stick to them, and you'll do fine." He left without another word, his footsteps fading into the echoing halls. Once again, I was alone. The guest log was much the same as the night before. Every room but room 13 marked as occupied, all in the same eerily uniform handwriting. I scanned the list for anomalies but found nothing, though the feeling of unease lingered. With a sigh, I folded the log and tucked it into the drawer under the desk. The laminated rules were still there, staring up at me like a warning. The first few hours were uneventful. I stayed busy reorganizing the lobby shelves, wiping down the front desk, and pacing to keep my nerves in check. It wasn't until around 11:45 p.m. that something happened. The bell at the front desk chimed, a sharp, sudden sound that startled me. I looked up, expecting to see a late-arriving guest, but the lobby was empty. My heart raced as I approached the desk. The bell sat untouched, and the air around it felt colder, heavier. Then I noticed it. The guest log was open, and a name had been added. Eleanor Wright, room 13. My hands trembled as I stared at the log. I hadn't opened it, and I was sure Mr. Carlyle hadn't mentioned anyone new checking in. Room 13 wasn't supposed to be occupied. The clock struck midnight, and a soft, rhythmic tapping echoed through the lobby. It wasn't coming from the front door or the windows, but from deeper within the hotel. My stomach tightened as I realized the sound was coming from the hallway that led to room 13. The rule was clear. I wasn't supposed to leave the front desk between 12 o'clock and 12:30 a.m. But the tapping was relentless, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. I clenched my fists, torn between curiosity and fear. Finally, I gave in. Grabbing the flashlight from beneath the desk, I stepped into the hallway. The air was colder here, carrying a faint metallic scent that made my skin crawl. The tapping grew louder as I approached room 13, each sound like a hammer striking a nail into my nerves. When I reached the door, it stopped. I stood frozen, staring at the brass numbers on the door. My breath came in shallow gasps, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The urge to knock, to see who or what was inside, was almost unbearable, but the rule screamed in my head. "Do not open room 13. I turned to leave, but as I took my first step, a voice called out, "Help me." The words were faint, muffled, but unmistakably coming from inside the room. It was a woman's voice, pleading, desperate. My heart clenched, and I spun back toward the door. What if someone was trapped inside? What if they needed help? Please, the voice said again, louder this time. I can't breathe. My hand reached for the doorknob before I could stop myself. The brass was icy cold, sending a jolt up my arm. I hesitated, my mind racing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But what if it was? The voice grew frantic, almost a scream now. Don't leave me. Please. Sweat dripped down my forehead as I wrestled with my instincts. Finally, I stepped back, dropping the flashlight in my haste. The beam of light rolled across the floor, illuminating the space beneath the door. There was nothing there. No shadow, no movement. But then, something shifted. A pale, skeletal hand slid into view, its fingers twitching as they pressed against the gap beneath the door. My blood turned to ice. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, and scrambled to pick up the flashlight. The hand remained there, motionless, as if waiting for me to make the next move. Without thinking, I bolted back to the lobby, my heart pounding in my chest. Back at the desk, I locked the front door and checked the camera feeds. The hallway leading to room 13 was empty, the door closed. There was no sign of the hand, no movement, no sound. It was as if nothing had happened. I sank into the chair, my hands still trembling. The clock read 12:29 a.m. I'd made it back just in time, but as I stared at the monitor, something caught my eye. In the corner of the lobby feed, a figure was standing by the fireplace. It was a woman, her back turned to the camera. She wore a tattered white dress, her hair cascading down her back in matted curls. She stood perfectly still, her head tilted slightly as if listening for something. My blood ran cold. There was no one in the lobby. I looked up from the monitor, my gaze darting to the fireplace. The space was empty. No woman, no figure, nothing. When I glanced back at the monitor, she was gone. The rest of the night was a blur of paranoia and dread. Every creak, every shadow felt like a threat. At one point, I thought I heard whispers coming from the guest log, faint murmurs that grew louder the longer I stared at the page. I slammed it shut and shoved it into the drawer, refusing to open it again. By the time Mr. Carlyle returned at dawn, I was a wreck. He took one look at me and smiled that unsettling smile of his. "You're adapting well," he said, his tone almost mocking. "I want to know what's going on here," I demanded, my voice shaking. He tilted his head, amused. "You're still here, aren't you? That's all that matters." He walked away before I could press him further, leaving me alone in the morning light. As I stepped outside, the warmth of the sun did little to ease the chill that had settled in my bones. I didn't know what was happening at Evermore Inn, but one thing was clear. This was no ordinary job. By my third night at the Evermore Inn, I wasn't sure if I was losing my mind or just getting used to the insanity. Every inch of that place seemed designed to unnerve me. From the polished floors that reflected distorted versions of the room to the faint sound of ticking that had no discernible source, it felt like the building itself was alive and watching. I arrived just after sundown, the sky painted with hues of orange and purple. The inn loomed in the fading light, its Gothic silhouette outlined against the horizon. For a moment, I considered turning back, but I knew I couldn't. The pull of the place was too strong, and a small, desperate part of me wanted answers. Mr. Carlyle was waiting for me in the lobby, his ever-present smile plastered across his face. "Welcome back, Alex," he said, his voice smooth as glass. "You're becoming quite the regular." I forced a tight smile, unsure if his comment was meant as a joke or something more ominous. He handed me the updated guest log, and I couldn't help but glance at room 13. As expected, the name from the previous night was gone, replaced by another. Emily Harper, room 13. The handwriting was the same as always, neat, deliberate, and utterly identical to every other name on the list. I opened my mouth to ask about it, but Carlyle cut me off with a wave of his hand. "Stick to the rules and everything will be fine," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Then, with a nod, he disappeared into the shadows of the back hallway. The lobby felt colder after he left. the air thick with an unspoken tension. I set the guest log on the desk and glanced at the laminated rules, reading them over for what felt like the 100th time. They didn't seem any less absurd, but they were the only things standing between me and whatever waited in the darker corners of the inn. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I busied myself with cleaning and organizing, anything to keep my mind occupied. Around 11 p.m., I settled into the chair behind the front desk and started flipping through the camera feeds. Most of them showed empty hallways and vacant rooms, but the feed for room 13 was still blacked out, just as it had been every night. I told myself I was imagining things, that the shadows weren't moving and the faint whispers were just the old building settling. But then the bell at the front desk chimed, and I froze. It wasn't the soft, polite ding I'd heard before. This time, it was sharp and jarring, the sound echoing through the empty lobby. I looked up, expecting to see someone standing there, but the desk was empty. My stomach twisted as I scanned the room, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. That's when I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the lobby, near the staircase that led to the second floor. A woman in a tattered white dress, her hair cascading in dark, tangled waves down her back. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, her head tilted slightly as if she were listening for something. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. "Can I help you?" She didn't respond. Slowly, I stood and took a step toward her. The air grew colder with every step, a biting chill that made my breath fog in the air. When I was just a few feet away, she turned her head, and my heart nearly stopped. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with dark hollows where her eyes should have been. Her lips were cracked, as if she hadn't spoken in years. She stared at me, unblinking, her empty gaze boring into mine. I stumbled back, my hands fumbling for the flashlight on my belt. The beam of light cut through the darkness, landing on her figure, and then she was gone. Just like that, she vanished, leaving nothing but an empty space where she had stood. I returned to the front desk, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge for support. The camera feeds were flickering now, static rippling across the monitors. One by one, the feeds went black, until only one remained. The hallway outside room 13. The camera showed the door slightly ajar, light spilling out into the hallway. My chest tightened as I stared at the screen. No one had checked into that room. Not really. I knew that. So who had opened the door? The rules were clear. Never open room 13. Never enter room 13. But they didn't say anything about what to do if the door opened on its own. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way down the hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing down on my chest like an invisible weight. When I reached the door, I hesitated, the beam of my flashlight trembling as it illuminated the brass numbers. The door creaked open wider, as if inviting me inside. "Is someone there?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. There was no answer, only the faint sound of humming coming from the room. It was a soft, melodic tune, almost like a lullaby. I stepped closer, peering through the crack in the door. The room was dimly lit, the furniture covered in white sheets that looked like ghosts waiting to pounce. In the center of the room stood a small, round table, and on it was a single item, a music box. The humming grew louder as I stared at the box, its lid slowly lifting on its own. A tiny ballerina twirled inside, her movements jerky and unnatural. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck and spun around, but the hallway was empty. When I turned back, the music box was gone. The room was completely dark, the door slamming shut with a force that made me jump. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as I raced down the hallway to the safety of the lobby. The rest of the night was a blur. The camera feeds remained blank, the silence in the lobby deafening. I didn't dare leave the desk again, didn't dare risk whatever was lurking in the shadows of room 13. When Mr. Carlyle arrived in the morning, he didn't seem surprised by my disheveled appearance. If anything, he looked amused. "You're doing well," he said, his tone almost mocking. "Most don't last this long." I didn't bother responding. I handed him the guest log and walked out into the morning light, my legs shaking with every step. I wasn't sure how much longer I could do this. But something about the inn kept pulling me back, something I couldn't explain. And I knew, deep down, that the worst was yet to come. When I returned to the Evermore Inn for my fourth night, it felt different. The atmosphere wasn't just eerie, it was oppressive. The inn seemed to have taken on a life of its own, as if it knew I was starting to unravel. The air was thick, heavy with an electric charge that made my skin prickle the moment I stepped inside. Mr. Carlyle greeted me at the front desk, his smile as unsettling as ever. He handed me the guest log without a word, and I immediately noticed something odd. The handwriting on the list was different. Not the neat, precise script I'd grown accustomed to, but messy and uneven, as if written in a hurry. Jonathan Reeves, room 13. I glanced up at Carlyle, but he was already walking away, disappearing into the shadows of the back office. My stomach churned as I stared at the name. This time, it wasn't just a generic placeholder. Jonathan Reeves. It felt real, tangible, and it sent a cold spike of dread through me. I set the log down and began my shift, trying to focus on the usual tasks. But the name lingered in my mind, gnawing at my thoughts. Who was Jonathan Reeves? And why was he listed under room 13? Around midnight, the familiar humming sound started again, faint and distant. I froze, my hands tightening around the mop handle as I listened. The sound was coming from the direction of room 13. My instinct screamed at me to stay put, to ignore it, but something stronger, curiosity, or maybe sheer stupidity, compelled me to move. The hallway leading to room 13 seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly into the darkness. The hum grew louder with every step, morphing into a low, guttural chant that made my chest tighten. When I finally reached the door, I stopped, my heart hammering in my chest. The door was slightly ajar, just like the night before. But this time, there was light spilling out, a sickly yellow glow that flickered like candlelight. I swallowed hard and peered inside, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The room was empty, or so it seemed at first glance. The furniture was still covered in sheets, the air thick with the scent of mildew. But then I saw it. A ledger sitting on the small round table in the center of the room. It was old, its leather cover cracked and worn, the edges of its pages yellowed with age. Against every ounce of common sense, I stepped inside. The air felt colder the moment I crossed the threshold, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I approached the table, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the silent room. The ledger was open to a page filled with names, written in the same messy script as the guest log from earlier. My eyes scanned the list, and my blood ran cold. Jonathan Reeves, Emily Harper, Lila Morrison, Alex Carter. My name was on the list. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of sick joke. But as I backed away, the room shifted around me. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching and twisting like living things. The chanting grew louder, the words incomprehensible but laced with malice. I turned to leave, but the door was no longer there. In its place was a solid wall, the sickly yellow light casting strange patterns across the surface. Panic set in as I spun around, searching for another way out. That's when I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, emerging from the shadows like smoke solidifying into flesh. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They moved slowly, their limbs jerky and unnatural, as if they were marionettes being controlled by unseen strings. One of them stepped forward, a tall man with a sunken face and a tattered suit. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, the chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence that made my ears ring. The man raised a hand, pointing directly at me. His hollow eyes seemed to bore into my soul, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if my very existence was being unraveled. The other figures closed in, their movements synchronized like a grotesque dance. Desperation took over. I grabbed the ledger from the table and clutched it to my chest, hoping, praying, that it held some kind of answer. The moment my fingers touched its cover, the figures stopped, their heads snapping toward the ledger in unison. The man in the tattered suit stepped closer, his bony hand reaching out. "Give it back," he rasped, his voice dry and cracked, like dead leaves rustling in the wind. I shook my head, clutching the ledger tighter. What is this? What's going on? I demanded, my voice trembling. The man's expression twisted into something resembling a smile, but it was more a grimace, a cruel mockery of emotion. You're part of it now, he said. You've always been part of it. Before I could respond, the room erupted in chaos. The figures lunged toward me, their hands grasping and clawing. I stumbled back, the ledger slipping from my grasp and falling to the floor. The moment it hit the ground, the figures froze, their bodies dissolving into wisps of smoke that were sucked into the walls. The door reappeared, the sickly yellow light replaced by the soft glow of the hallway lamps. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the ledger and ran, my footsteps echoing behind me as I sprinted back to the lobby. When I burst into the lobby, Mr. Carlyle was waiting, his smile as calm and unsettling as ever. He didn't seem surprised to see the ledger in my hands. "Ah, you found it," he said, his tone almost cheerful. "I was wondering how long it would take." "What is this?" I demanded, slamming the ledger onto the desk. "Why is my name in here?" Carlyle chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "That ledger is the heart of this place," he said. "It holds the names of everyone who's ever stayed at the Evermore Inn, past, present, and future." I stared at him, my mind reeling. "Future? What are you talking about?" "You've seen the rules, haven't you?" he said, ignoring my question. "You've followed them, and you've survived. But the rules are only the beginning. This place has its own way of keeping track. And now, you're part of it." I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but Carlyle's expression told me I wouldn't get any. He took the ledger from the desk and tucked it under his arm, his eyes glinting with something I couldn't identify. Amusement, perhaps, or maybe pity. "Good night, Alex," he said, his voice soft but final. "I'll see you tomorrow." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I walked out of the inn and into the cold night, my hands shaking and my mind racing. I didn't know what was real anymore, what was true or false. All I knew was that the Evermore Inn wasn't just a building. It was a trap, a living, breathing entity that had ensnared me in its web, and I had no idea how to escape.